Good morning and welcome to Governance Dialogues. It's a pleasure to host you back on my program. My name is Alissa Kole and I'm the Managing Director of Governance Center. And for those of you who have already tuned into these conversations, you would know that Governance Dialogues is a program that we launched to delve into the world of governance and conversations, which I believe to be fascinating with directors, with executives, with regulators, and even with philosophers over the past 6 months or so. And for those of you who are new to our program, we encourage you to view past episodes, which we hope you'd find of interest, but also to engage with us by subscribing to our channel and also following us on social media and perhaps for those of you who are interested, delving into further content available on our website, www.govern.center. And over the past 6 months, we've been talking quite a bit about one topic in particular, which is, I think, primordial in the world of corporate governance, which is director duties and director responsibilities. And this is, in fact, a topic on which regulators also have zoomed in quite a bit over the last years in issuing corporate governance codes, listing requirements, and other sorts of laws and regulations where director duties are addressed. And in these conversations over the past 6 months on governance dialogues, we've already talked quite a bit with a number of directors, because ultimately they are in the best position to discuss their duties and challenges they have in executing them, looking at company-specific situations such as Wirecard, but also country-specific evolutions in terms of how director duties are defined. And there have been a number of evolutions, as we know, in the last year or so in corporate legislation that defines director duties. And in this conversation, I would like to perhaps return to this conversation of director duties and their definition in conversation with an expert who's joining us today from France, Michel de Fabiani. Michel, bienvenue et bonjour.
Merci.
It's a pleasure.
Bonjour. Well, good morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you join us on this program. Of course, I've heard a lot about your work on governance, but for our viewers, I'd like to perhaps say a few words about your background, introduce you a little bit more. Today, you're representing or officially wearing the ECODA hat. ECODA is a voice of European directors, Confederation of European Directors, but you also have, as far as I know, responsibilities with the International Corporate Governance framework, where you also head up their policy committee, and you are the president and founder of Cercle Économique de Souilly, which is a Paris-based think tank. And perhaps most importantly, for the purpose of our conversation today, you have held and continue to hold a number of board posts. You've been appointed a chairman and CEO of BNP Paribas France, a BP Mobile Fuel joint ventures. So a number of, I think, interesting hats that you hold, and I look forward to your perspectives on a number of these questions that we'll be discussing today. And the first one that I would like to ask is, of course, relative to developments of last year. And one of the sort of notable developments that we've heard last year was the commissioning by the European Commission of a study from Ernst & Young on director duties and sustainable corporate governance, which is sort of like a mouthful on itself. And that study ultimately argued by looking at metrics related to, dividend payout ratios and whatnot, and we can argue about the methodologies, that director duties need to be further redefined in laws or soft or hard legislation in European member countries, because they continue to be directors, that is, quite short-termist in terms of their thinking and behavior. So I would like to ask you, perhaps to start off with, what are your thoughts on that study? And indeed, perhaps a secondary question, do you think that these type of approaches that look at further expanding director duties are at this point constructive, or whether we are perhaps heaping too much on directors at this point in time?
Well, I think the Ernst & Young study is one study. So we think the Commission should not rely on one study. And I understand that They want more contributions, and this is welcome by all other academics and other sources. I think if I want to characterize the Ernst & Young study, and the questionnaire is reflecting that, it is in a way very simplifying and even sometimes caricaturing the situation. When they say that, or they imply in the question, for instance, that short-termism is the characteristics of shareholders and long-termism is the characteristics of stakeholders, I think this is exaggerated. But I don't want to comment too much on the EY study because there will be others. And one thing I want to take out of the EY study, because let's be constructive, is the shareholder and stakeholder relationship. I think this is very important. This point is very important. And at ECODA, we think that we are the voice of European directors. And we think that we are there to support shareholders and the relevant stakeholders of a company. And I would make a point on this. The EY study and sometimes the Commission and the Parliament tend to consider all stakeholders have their say in any company. This is not right. We think that the shareholders are the shareholders of the company. And the stakeholders are, we call them the relevant stakeholders, those who have a relationship with the company, one way or another. Now, a third thing I want to recall that if there is no shareholder, there is no company. So that's the first point. Whether it's the state, whether it's a family, whether it's pension funds, whether it's a group of friends, whether it's very dispersed or very concentrated, you have shareholders. And this is the first start of the company. So obviously, the board members represent the shareholders and they have to take account of their views. But if you have no stakeholder, you have no company. You may have created a company on paper, but it needs to work. So the first thing is you need employees, you need workforce, one way or another. So the employees are certainly the number one stakeholders, are the internal stakeholders. And in Europe, the employees have a special consideration. In some countries, we even have board representation. In most countries, we have board attendance. And this is a situation which is a characteristic, and we are very proud of this characteristic in Europe. We say employees are our number one stakeholders. But you have also the suppliers. So some suppliers, if they are dominantly supplying your company, are almost internal in a way. So suppliers certainly the number two stakeholders, and they are necessary, whether they are service providers, industrial equipment, etc. They are necessary, and their views need to be taken into account because you work with them every day. Then you have all other groups, the customers, of course. If you have no customer, I believe the company will not survive, not even in the long term, in the short term. So customers are important. I would make a difference because sometimes customers can be a one-day customer or a longer-term customer. So you need to understand if you have long-term customers or only short-term, that would be a problem probably. So you need to fidéliser, we say in French, to create
loyalize
your customers. Yes.
Yes.
Then you have all other parties who play a role in your activities, or for which your activities has an impact. Let's take the countries. If you are a big company in a country, in a small country, you are a big stakeholder. The country state is a big stakeholder. You have cities, you have villages. If you have a big industrial plant in a village, of course, you are very important for that village and vice versa. So we need to take account all the views and the interests of the stakeholders which are relevant to the activities of the company. And this brings me to another point, which is the risk and impact. I think it's very important, and this is mentioned in the EY report, that the risk and impact of your company are appreciated, known, discussed at board level with management, indeed, because management manage the risk every day, and the boards ensure that they are well managed. But the new thing which has been brought by COVID, in fact, is the which has been evidenced by COVID, is the importance of the impact of your activities and of the risk which you encounter. So we've come to a probabilistic risk, which was 1 every 100 years something happens, so it's not important. Oh, but if it happens tomorrow, it's very important. It's more than very important. And we have realized that. So the risk and impact assessment is another duty of board members.
That's an interesting number of interesting points you raised, but I would like to come back to this to this kind of hierarchization or prioritization, a little bit of stakeholders that you've outlined, because it's interesting. It's indeed quite specific to the European corporate governance model, where employees do sit in some countries on boards or observe. And what's also interesting, I think, in your remarks, you point out that stakeholders are not necessarily, as it is. You're right, is often assumed are always sort of long-termist. And, you know, we have a very also short-termist stakeholders in terms of customer base, and that might be quite transitory. So it's interesting how the balancing of board duties can occur in that context where stakeholders kind of perspectives may be different. And also, as you say, in different countries where, you know, for example, in France, it might be that the villages or sort of the towns where companies operate might actually be significantly affected, as they are in you know, in other countries. Like I've worked quite a bit, for example, in Egypt, and one of the problems with dismantling some of the state-owned companies is precisely that if you take these companies away from that particular location, then there is, you know, economic activity and sort of livelihoods depend on that. So it's an interesting balancing of duties and responsibilities with the profitability angle, which is obviously, as you say, is a primordial one. But I would like to come back to sort of this balancing of duties and what the regulators are maybe have in mind going forward. I know that you have a perspective from sort of the both sides of the Atlantic, in particular in Europe, but coming back to the European situation, what are some of the areas that you think the Commission is currently considering to introduce in terms of directors' duties going forward? Are there going to be perhaps further proposals in terms of sustainability responsibilities, ESG, or do you think the conversation will stop here?
No, certainly not. I think first thing I want to say that in Europe, we have had a terrible year in all senses for Europe. COVID, health issues, Brexit, don't forget, a very important economic and political issue. We have had elections in many countries where extreme parties, either right or left, have been raising. We have had problems with the US in terms of business, with China. Hopefully this one seems to be improving. Russia, Turkey, the list is very long.
Of course.
So in a world where there are crises of all sorts, you can imagine that the companies have had to be alarmed and to be looking at what was happening in very deep sense. So, of course, corporate governance for the company was key. And if you had good corporate governance, you were better equipped to deal with crisis. So this being said, we also had in parallel a new commission with strong personalities, Ursula von der Leyen, or Thierry Breton, or Didier Reynders. They are very strong personalities, so that's very important because it shows the importance of the European Union. And at the same time, we had a new parliament with new movements, whether they were the Greens, the Renew Europe, the leftist or the rightist were present in parliament. So we have a completely different geographic, political, economic scene. And therefore, you can imagine that corporate governance, which is about the companies and the business who make these things work, despite in whatever the environment is very important. So the idea of looking at the legislation and reinforcing legislation in all directions is certainly on the table of the European Commission. Sustainable governance, they call it sustainable corporate governance, directors' duties, supply chain, due diligence, climate, sustainable finance. This is all under the umbrella of environmental and social governance. So obviously things will be happening. So for us, as the voice of directors, we are the doers, and we will have to implement all these legislation, whether it's hard law, whether it's soft law. We consider that at the EU level, the regulators should be principle-based and targeted. We want a set of principles and corresponding frameworks which should apply to all countries. That's obvious. But please not go to the latest details at the European level. Leave it to the countries or even the cities or even the village where you operate, which will take the right measures.
So I hear you on kind of the agenda of the European Commission going forward. And one issue that's come to the fore in the conversations in standard setting conversations on corporate governance over the past year has obviously been also this issue of corporate purpose, where there have been lively debates on both sides of the Atlantic. For example, I've listened in to conversations between Colin Mayer and Lucha and Babchuk, who have argued over this several times, and as I'm sure you have as well. And I would like to come back to this issue of company interest, because one of the key developments we've seen has been the redefinition or adjustment of company interest in the French law, but also, as we explored in one of our previous episodes, also in German legislation. And perhaps this is a trend that's a little bit new and that will take hold in other countries. So I would like to ask you, about that movement, but also its effect ultimately on companies, because we've heard a lot about one example, which is Danone, which has changed its articles of association to reflect this new and broader social purpose. But beyond this one or two examples, frankly, not much from the corporate sector. So I wonder what your thoughts are on the impact of these measures, and once they've been sort of transposed in corporate or country-specific legislation, on the behavior of specific companies.
Well, it is true that several member states, France, of course, Spain, Germany, have encouraged companies to define or redefine their corporate purpose in the context of sustainability. Danone has been the first, but there are many, and I think in the top 40 listed companies at the moment, almost half of them, if not more, have already worked on this definition. So you look at your corporate purpose, you redefine. I want to point that it is not a mandatory obligation, it is a recommended obligation, recommended, of course, and for the biggest companies, it's certainly adopted by most of them, and the codes, or not the law, but the codes will probably recommend also that. Just one small mention on between law and codes. Law is hard law, and this is the minimum you have to do. So you cannot impose everything to everybody. It's the minimum everybody has to do. And the other soft law, and usually through codes and recommendations. And this is a way to foster best practices and to lead by example for the leading companies. Danone was just an example, but there are plenty of other examples in other sectors. So it helps. When you redefine your purpose, it helps to clarify the scope of directives. director's duties, and to ensure that the strategy is corresponding to your purpose, needs to be sometimes readjusted accordingly, and that you set the right KPIs on performance, financial, non-financial performance, and that this is reflected in all your policies, whether it's remuneration, whether it's recruitment, health, safety, environment, etc., etc. So the exercise is sound and healthy for all companies in reality. Even if you are a small company, you can think about it. It's not necessary to be only a large company. And for you even have seen that happening for institutions, associations, political parties. So the idea of a purpose, of course, corporate purpose for a corporation, but a purpose is important because it fixes the scene, if you want. It gives the scene where you will operate, then how you will operate, what you will do, strategy, plans, business plan, budget, etc., etc.
So you're
and all policies.
That definition of corporate purpose actually cascades into sort of other tangible processes like risk management and whatnot in the companies where you are currently involved.
Yes, indeed. When you have redefined or confirmed your purpose, you relook at your strategy, you check whether it fits with the purpose. And in any case, whether you redefine your purpose or not, you need to review your strategy after all the crises which we have seen. It's obvious. In fact, as early as second quarter, ECODA recommended to all board members in Europe to have special meetings to review their strategy, to review their policies, and to ensure that they were facing the potential crisis, which in fact was not even potential, it was real and became very real. So redefining the strategy and adapting your policies, your performance measures, financial and non-financial, is obviously absolutely necessary, especially in crisis time, but permanently. And this is a regular exercise which boards should do.
Right, and one of the crises that you've mentioned in your comments earlier, I mean, and there's been, as you say, many in Europe, unfortunately, not only COVID, but sort of the tensions with China, which actually have been more on the other side of the Atlantic, but also in Europe, in particular, in one important dimension, and that is the sort of the issue of supply chains. Which have been receiving increasing attention, and in the European Commission, some of the European MPs, as you know, have recently raised the issue of responsible supply chains, especially in the area of sort of cotton, where China has an important role. In particular, in one province of China, which is responsible for 20% of cotton production worldwide, and a number of activists have been pointing out to the exploitation of the Uyghur population in that part of the country, and the responsibilities that companies have to essentially engage with their supply chains and sort of monitor the quality of products, but also human rights and other obligations. And ultimately, I think also comes back to the conversation around board responsibilities, because these activists have actually pointed to fingers quite actively, but also I think fairly, to boards of large companies like Kering and others in France and in other countries of the EU around what boards are doing on this issue. And so I would like to ask you, with that, what is your sort of take on the situation? How fair is it to expect boards to be responsible for ultimately what can be quite a lengthy value chain? And what role can boards really have in addressing today some of these issues, which could be quite, frankly, serious in this particular case with the China situation?
Yeah. Well, first, China, of course, is on the forefront of every discussion at the moment. But if you think of what's happening in the world, and for companies who have operations worldwide, which is the largest, and those who are listed usually, or big family companies, Frankly, China is not the only case.
No.
You have situations in Latin America, which are problematic, in Russia, in India, in some parts, in Turkey, Armenia, not to mention some critical situation in the Middle East. So this issue is a general one, which is about, again, the risks and the impact you have in countries, in that case, where you operate. Now, one point I want to mention, of course, the suppliers chain in the value chain is very important because it is, as we said, we have the employees, suppliers, and then customers. We think that pragmatic approaches exist, like the OECD principles, which are very useful as a framework. We think that some countries have gone very far, like France. It's not obvious that you can implement all that because you have to be careful of one thing when you're in business. It's if you say, well, this country is difficult or this place is difficult, just get out of it. And that's what usually is the recommendations of large NGOs, international NGOs, who have a very broad approach, but they don't see the reality sometimes, or they see just one lens of the reality. If you go out, it's easy. You just divest, and then you will be replaced by someone who probably will be not so keen and not so strong on human rights or employee conditions or remuneration, etc., etc. So we have to balance the risk of staying in a place and ensuring you keep your values, you keep your principles working, and leaving because it's easy. You say, well, if I leave this, I will not be criticized. But then you come to a competition problem. Yes. Can you leave China as a whole? I mean, this would be ridiculous.
Yes.
But you must ensure that where you operate in China, you ensure your values. And if you have a purpose, if you have values, if you have policies, you ensure they are implemented in the same way. And of course, this is where you will be judged, and you will need to report on that. And this will be part of the exercise of reporting, telling the truth of what you are doing. What are your processes in place, and report about them. And then the shareholders, but the stakeholders will judge you. And believe me, if the shareholders realize that your relevant stakeholders are not happy, they will not be happy either.
Well, I think that I mean, there are a couple of points on that, and this idea of divesting versus operating, it's also been, as you know, flushed out in other conversations on corporate governance, not only in the context of value chains, but actually in terms of investors, institutional investors staying or leaving as investors in specific companies. And so, for example, you know, some large institutional investors, as you know, Norges had taken the approach that, for example, they do no longer wish to be investors in coal companies. So they said, you know, this is not in line with our values or with our and that policy has been criticized even internally because it could be financially problematic or value degenerating, let's say, in that particular case. But that is the position they've taken, and so I think it's an interesting debate. Personally, I'm more on the side of human rights here, because I think that some of the situations that have been revealed also demonstrate responsibilities of companies to engage differently in different regions where they cannot necessarily affect change or implement their values as they would like to, or I think as their shareholders and stakeholders would like them to. So the question there is rather complicated. But I think just to close our conversation today, and I'm not sure we can answer that in one half-an-hour episode, is ultimately about and a lot of what we discussed today was also about that, about sort of the division or the balancing of responsibilities between boards and investors and between states. in terms of European Commission or national state setting? Where is the right let's say line in the sand when it comes to corporate governance, in terms of leaving responsibilities for boards and executives to decide and set their values and in the value chains and in relationship with stakeholders and whatnot, and where does the state or the Commission, the supranational bodies, the OECD, the World Bank, other standard setters come in and say, these are the rules that we expect you to adhere to. And I think that's sort of perhaps the last question or note that I would like to end this conversation with.
Well, of course, we support rules which are applied ideally worldwide. So this is the ideal. We know this is very difficult. United Nations rules are very difficult to be implemented in every place. So you need to find regional, and this is European Commission, for instance. OECD is trans-regional, if you want, and you have a sectorial, professional sectors who take positions, the energy sector, the automobile, etc., etc. Now, one point I want to make is that it is very clear that business alone cannot solve all the human issues, societal issues. Business alone cannot. Of course, we are the instrument by which things are happening. We produce, we sell, we advise, etc., etc. But it is very important that the political world, as well as the NGOs, play a role, but the role has to be played together. It's not NGOs against political world or political world against companies or NGOs against companies. It's together. It is more difficult indeed than splitting and saying, well, I don't want to talk to you anymore. That's the easiest way to do a thing. But if you want things to improve, how will you improve the economic situation, the labor situation in countries where there are problems, if the more advanced companies quit? That's a big question. You remember an old story, South Africa, at the time of apartheid, you had two options. The American companies decided to go out. The British companies stayed, but they stayed, but they say, we stay, but we fight for non-apartheid. And we develop the Black population, the Black people who will take charge of our operations when apartheid has gone. It was very much more difficult, I was in BP at the time, tell you, to do that than to quit. Quit is a financial exercise. You lose this, but you hope to regain it elsewhere. When you stay, you are part of the game. And of course, you need to be part of the game on the right side. So I think it is an improvement to stay and to ensure that you lead by example. And you say to the governments, you say to the unions, you say to the people, look, this is what we should do, and we do it. And please try to do it. There may be a situation where this becomes untenable, okay, but there should be a minority situation, not a majority situation.
Right. No, I think it's a fascinating conversation. I think it's a difficult one, and I often grapple with that. In your interest, your example on South Africa is very interesting. But I think it's a difficult divide, and I also sort of tend to agree with you that there's also a large role for national and international standard setting in this field. And in my personal view, that humbly speaking, I think that perhaps a little bit too much is currently being heaped on directors in terms of balancing shareholder, stakeholder, and other priorities, in a sense that that are ultimately, in some cases, frankly, quite conflicting. So, but I think it's been a very interesting conversation talking about how European directors have survived through the various crises that you've just outlined, and the directions that policymakers, be it at the EU level, but also at the national level, are thinking of in terms of how director duties will be shaped and how their exercise will be executed. So thank you very much for your time today and for joining us from Paris. Merci.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have had you on this program. And for our viewers, we do intend to continue this conversation with directors of companies from around the world, as we have in the past. And we'll be delving in some of the more sector-specific or topic-specific challenges as we move ahead in our program, to which I invite you to subscribe. And of course, engage with us in terms of by sharing your views and ideas on content that you think would be interesting to explore going further. But for the purpose of today's episode, thank you all for joining us. And it's been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thank you. All together, don't forget.